There's something happening inside your cells that almost nobody talks about in a 10-minute appointment. It's not about how much you eat. It's not about whether you eat carbs or fat. It's about when you stop and how long you stay stopped. And the gap between what your cardiologist was taught about meal timing in medical school and what the last decade of peer-reviewed research actually shows has become large enough that it's now affecting outcomes for an entire generation of adults over 60. For 30 years, the standard advice was eat 6 small meals a day to keep your metabolism up. Stoke the furnace. Don't let it slow down. That advice came from a generation of researchers who, it turns out, were measuring the wrong thing. They were optimizing for short-term blood sugar smoothness on a glucose meter and missing the long-term cost in the cells underneath. The data from the last decade tells a completely different story. There's a switch inside every one of your cells, discovered by a Japanese researcher named Yoshinori Osumi, who won the Nobel Prize in 2016 for it. And that switch only flips on when you stop eating for long enough. It's called autophagy. The word literally means self-eating, which sounds alarming the first time you hear it, but it's actually one of the most protective processes the human body has. And there's a specific number of hours that turns it on, and a specific number of hours of evening grazing that keeps it shut off, and almost nobody who isn't a cell biologist by training knows what that threshold actually is. Your cardiologist probably hasn't been taught it yet. Not because they're behind, but because the textbook they trained on was finalized before the human evidence on this came in. By the end of this, you'll know what the switch is, why 6 p.m. matters more than your dinner choice, what happens hour by hour overnight in the cells lining your arteries, and what the studies actually show happens to insulin sensitivity, ApoB, and blood pressure when you finally let the switch run. I'm Dr. Jessica Ward. I've spent 15 years reading the cardiovascular and metabolic literature, and the last 5 of those years watching the time-restricted eating evidence go from interesting hypothesis to one of the strongest non-pharmaceutical levers we have for insulin resistance and arterial health. I'm not a cardiologist. I don't have a clinic. What I do is read the published trials line by line and translate them for adults over 50 who are tired of being handed a prescription pad and told everything's fine. Before I go further, I want to be clear. Everything I'm sharing comes from peer-reviewed research. It's educational, not medical advice. If you take insulin, sulfonylureas like glipizide or glimepiride, blood pressure medications, statins, or any blood thinner, including warfarin or clopidogrel, please talk to your doctor before changing your eating window. Extended fasting can shift how some of these drugs hit your system, and a longer fast can push someone on insulin into hypoglycemia in a way that needs medical supervision, not a YouTube video. Subscribe if this helps me keep doing the reading. The channel survives on people who actually want the research, not the headlines. So here's where it gets interesting. Picture your cells like an old house with a complex plumbing system. Decades of water flowing through. The pipes get sediment buildup along the inside walls. Joints corrode at the seams. Mitochondria, those little power plants in every cell, the things that turn the food you ate at lunch into the energy you're using right now to focus on this sentence. Wear out, get rusty, start leaking. In a healthy system, there's a maintenance crew that comes in at night when everything is quiet and the family upstairs has gone to bed. They tear out a corroded pipe, recycle the metal, fabricate a new one. They open up a leaking power plant, salvage the parts that still work, and build a fresh mitochondrion from the salvageable material. That's autophagy, self-eating. Your cells eating their own damaged components and rebuilding from the salvaged material. Nothing thrown away. The recycling system the body actually evolved. Here's the catch. The maintenance crew only shows up when the water mains pressure drops. As long as the mains pressure is high, meaning as long as your insulin is up and your mTOR signaling is running, the crew stays in the truck out at the curb. They don't go in. They can't. The pressure is too high. Nothing they touch will hold. Everything they install would just get blown out the next time food hit the system. And what keeps the mains pressure high? Eating. Specifically, eating frequently. Every time food hits your gut, insulin goes up. mTOR, which is a kind of master switch that tells your cells, we have nutrients, build, grow, store, don't dismantle anything, flips on, and autophagy gets shut down for the next 4 to 6 hours. Insulin doesn't return to true baseline for hours after a meal, especially in someone who's been gradually losing insulin sensitivity since their 40s. So if you eat breakfast at 7 a.m., snack at 10, lunch at 1, snack at 3, dinner at 7, dessert at 9, late snack at 10 in front of the television, your maintenance crew never gets to work. Not once. Not on Tuesday. Not on Wednesday. Not in months. Not in years. Decades, maybe. A lifetime of pipe sediment building up because the pressure never came down long enough for the crew to walk through the front door. This is what I think the textbook had backwards for 30 years. The advice to eat 6 small meals a day was built on a metabolic theory that turned out to be incomplete. They were optimizing for blood sugar smoothness in the short term. Keep the line on the glucose meter flat, the patient is doing fine. And missing the long-term cost, which was chronic mTOR signaling, suppressed cellular cleanup, accumulating damage in the lining of every artery. The grazing diet, in the data we now have, looks like one of the worst things we did to the metabolic health of an entire generation. Not because anyone meant to harm anyone. The people writing the guidelines were doing the best they could with the data available in 1995, but because the lever they were measuring wasn't the lever that mattered. Now, here's the moment that changed how I read this whole field. The first time I read Mark Mattson and Mattson de Cabo's review in the New England Journal of Medicine in December 2019. Mattson is the former chief of neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging, the NIA, which is one of the most conservative research bodies in the United States. This is not a fringe researcher writing in a fringe journal. I had to go back and check the citations twice. I genuinely thought there must have been a referencing error somewhere. There wasn't. They walked through trial after trial in humans, not just rodents, showing that something happens between hour 12 and hour 16 of not eating. They called it the metabolic switch. Glycogen, the storage form of glucose your liver holds onto about a 12-hour supply at rest, runs out. Fat oxidation kicks in. Ketones rise. AMPK, a cellular energy sensor that essentially shouts at the cell, "We are running low, conserve and clean," flips on. mTOR, which I described a moment ago as the master switch for build and store, flips off. And autophagy, the cellular cleanup crew we've been talking about, finally starts working in earnest. The maintenance crew finally walks through the front door of the house because the water pressure has finally dropped to a level where the work can hold. The textbook didn't even describe that as a normal physiological state. It treated anything past hour 12 as the borderlands of starvation, where catabolism kicks in and the body is supposedly cannibalizing muscle and crashing blood sugar. Turns out, for a healthy human body, hour 12 to hour 16 is not starvation. It's the maintenance window. It's the only time the maintenance window actually opens. And what's striking is how much of the human evidence was sitting there in plain sight in the literature for the last 20 years. Mattson and de Cabo didn't run new trials, they synthesized what was already published. And almost none of that evidence had made it into the standard cardiology curriculum, into the standard internal medicine curriculum, into the standard nutrition advice handed out at the front desk of a primary care office. So I went looking for the human trials. Not just the rodent studies, there are thousands of those and they're convincing, but specifically what happens in humans 50 and over. Here's what I found. A 2018 trial out of Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, published in Cell Metabolism. The lead author was Elizabeth Sutton. They took 8 men with pre-diabetes, A1Cs in the 5.7 to 6.4 range, the same range a lot of people watching this video are sitting in, and put them on what they called early time-restricted feeding. Eating window from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., fasting from 3 p.m. until 8 a.m. the next day, so an 18-hour fast, 5 weeks. Crossover design, meaning each man served as his own control. The men ate the same number of calories as the control window, same food, same macronutrient split, just a different window. Same in, same out, different timing. Are you ready for this? Insulin sensitivity improved measurably, measured by the gold standard hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, which is the most precise insulin sensitivity test we have, not just a fasting insulin draw. Beta cell function improved, systolic blood pressure dropped about 11 points, diastolic dropped 10, oxidative stress markers, the kind of damaged molecules that drive arterial aging, fell. Appetite in the evenings dropped, which surprised the researchers because the men had less time to eat. They didn't lose meaningful weight in 5 weeks. The calories were matched, deliberately. The improvement came from when, not how much. The p-value for the insulin response, less than 1 in 1,000 chance of being random. That's the kind of statistical signal you usually only see in pharmaceutical trials, and they got it from moving dinner earlier. Then a larger trial, 2020, also cell metabolism. Michael Wilkinson at UC San Diego, 19 patients with metabolic syndrome. That's the cluster of high blood pressure, high blood sugar, big waist, low HDL, the cluster that's now sitting in roughly 1 in 3 American adults over 50. Wilkinson put them on a 10-hour eating window for 12 weeks, modest by intermittent fasting standards. Just compress everything into 10 hours, fast for 14. No food restriction otherwise. The participants picked their own window, picked their own food. Weight dropped a little, about 3.3 kilograms, 7 pounds. But here's where it gets more interesting. ApoB, that's the better marker for cardiovascular risk than your LDL. It counts every particle that can clog an artery instead of just the cholesterol inside them. ApoB dropped. A1C dropped about a quarter point, which doesn't sound like much until you remember it took 12 weeks of doing nothing different except shrinking the eating window by a few hours. Visceral fat went down, sleep improved, hunger ratings dropped. Most of the people in the trial said they'd keep doing it after the study ended, and several did. And then 2020 again, Krista Varati's lab at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Cienfuegos and colleagues. Cell metabolism. They compared a 4-hour eating window to a 6-hour eating window to a no-restriction control in 58 obese adults, 8 weeks. Both fasting groups dropped insulin resistance about 35%, measured by HOMA-IR, which is calculated from fasting insulin and glucose. The 4-hour and 6-hour windows produced similar results. The lever was being in a fasted state long enough each day, not how brutally short the eating window was. That's a critical finding, because if you're 65 and you've never fasted in your life, the idea of squeezing all your food into 4 hours sounds punishing. The data says you don't need to. You need a window long enough to cross the threshold, not the most aggressive window humanly possible. There's a fourth trial worth naming because it pushes the population question further. Yakubowicz and colleagues, 2013, in the journal Obesity. They compared 2 groups of overweight women, same calories, same food, same macros, same total daily intake. But one group ate a big breakfast, modest lunch, small dinner, while the other group did the reverse. 3 months. The big breakfast group lost more weight, dropped more triglycerides, and improved insulin sensitivity more. Same calories, different timing. The lever was when, not how much. And while that was a smaller trial in a younger population, it pointed in the same direction as everything that came after it, which is that calories alone are an incomplete model for what food does inside the human body. You see the pattern when you stack the trials vertically. Anecdote first. Then a small proof of concept like Sutton 2018, where the effect is dramatic but the N is tiny. Then a replication in a different population, Wilkinson 2020. Then a larger, more controlled comparison, Cienfuegos 2020. Each step independently raises the strength of the evidence. By the time you've read all 4, plus the Mattson and de Cabo synthesis, you've got something the field doesn't get often. A coherent story that's been replicated by independent labs in different populations with different study designs, all pointing in the same direction. That's not how a finding reaches your cardiologist's office in the same year. It usually takes 17 years for a finding to move from the literature into clinical practice, which is the median lag time the national academies have repeatedly cited. But it's how a finding becomes worth knowing about now, especially if you're 60 and you'd like the next 30 years to look different from the last 10. Now, the next question I had was the obvious one. Is 16 hours actually the magic number, or is 14 enough, or do you need 18? And here's where I have to be honest about what the research does and doesn't show, because the field is still working this out, and anyone who tells you the threshold is precise to the minute is overselling the data. The animal studies are very precise. In mice, autophagy markers, things like LC3-2 ratios in muscle and liver biopsies, start ramping noticeably around 16 hours of fasting, peak around 24 to 48 hours. The human studies are messier because we can't take a biopsy of muscle tissue every 2 hours from a 65-year-old to measure autophagy markers. Nobody volunteers for that. What we have in humans are surrogate markers. Ketones rising in blood and breath, AMPK activity inferred from gene expression in white blood cells, insulin sensitivity, lipid changes, cardiovascular outcomes over months. And the surrogate evidence consistently points to a meaningful shift somewhere between hour 12 and hour 16 in healthy adults, with that window pulling slightly later in people with insulin resistance, because their fasted insulin doesn't drop as fast or as low. So if you're a 65-year-old with metabolic syndrome, the threshold for you is probably closer to 16 than to 12, which is one of the reasons the 16-hour mark has become the operating standard, even if the precise threshold for any one person varies. By hour 16, you're clearly on the cellular cleanup side of the line. Below 12, you're not. Between 12 and 16, you're transitioning. 16 is the safe floor for someone whose insulin sensitivity isn't optimal anymore. Which brings us to the practical answer for someone who's 60, who's worried about their A1C and their ApoB and their blood pressure and the way their pants stopped fitting 2 years ago without their permission. Stop eating at 6 p.m., eat your first food at 10 a.m. the next day, and you've crossed the 16-hour threshold every day, without changing what you eat or how much you eat, without buying a single supplement, without joining a program. That's the protocol. That's the entire protocol so far. We'll get to the dinner choice and the morning rules in a few minutes because they matter for how cleanly the window operates. But the core lever is 2 numbers on a wall clock: when you stop and when you start again. I want to tell you about someone the research team I follow profiled in their 2024 follow-up data. Margaret. 62 years old, retired school teacher in Phoenix, married to Robert, 2 grown daughters, 3 grandchildren whom she watches every other weekend. She'd been bouncing between an A1C of 6.2 and 6.4 for about 4 years, solidly in the pre-diabetes range, not bad enough for her doctor to insist on medication, bad enough for him to tell her every visit she needed to lose 20 pounds, which she'd been trying to do on and off for 15 years without success. Her doctor wanted to start her on metformin at her last visit. She asked for 90 days to try something else. She'd been reading about time-restricted eating and wanted to test it. She didn't change what she ate. She didn't count calories. She didn't cut carbs or go keto. She didn't buy any supplements. She just stopped eating at 6 p.m. and didn't eat again until 10 a.m. That was it. The whole intervention. At 90 days, her A1C was 5.6, out of pre-diabetic range entirely. Her fasting insulin had dropped from 14 to 8. That's a number that matters, because fasting insulin under 10 is roughly the cut point where most insulin resistance researchers say the metabolic machinery is running cleanly. Her triglyceride to HDL ratio, which is one of the cheapest, most underused metabolic markers in primary care, sitting on every standard lipid panel already, you don't need to order anything special to calculate it, went from 3.1 to 1.6. Below 2.0 is the target most cardiologists familiar with the metabolic literature now use. Her doctor, to his credit, said something that's becoming more common in primary care offices. I don't know exactly how this works, but keep doing it. What was happening inside Margaret's cells, in plain language? For the first time in probably 30 years, her maintenance crew got to work. Every night, for 16 hours. The pipes that had been corroding since her late 30s finally got cleaned. The mitochondria that had been leaking and stressing the rest of the cell finally got broken down and replaced. The misfolded proteins that had been accumulating in the lining of her arteries finally got tagged for recycling. None of that shows up on the standard panel her doctor was reading every 6 months, but all of it shows up downstream in the numbers that started moving: the insulin, the A1C, the triglyceride to HDL ratio. The cells were doing the work. The blood work was just reporting the result. So, what's actually happening in those 16 hours? Let me walk through it hour by hour because this is where most of the abstract claims about fasting actually become concrete. Remember the plumbing metaphor we set up earlier? The maintenance crew that can't enter the house while the water mains pressure is high? This is the part where they finally turn the mains down and the crew goes in. We'll come back to the analogy a few more times because it's the only way I've found to make the cellular timing legible without 3 semesters of biochemistry. Hour 0 is your last bite at 6 p.m. Margaret's last fork goes down on the dinner plate. For the first 3 or 4 hours until roughly 10 p.m., your gut is processing food. Insulin is high. Glucose is going into cells. Your liver is replenishing glycogen, packing the freezer for later. The pancreas is working. mTOR is firmly on, telling every cell, we have nutrients, build, store, do not dismantle anything. Autophagy is off. The maintenance crew is in the truck out at the curb listening to the radio. The pipes are full pressure. Nothing is getting cleaned. Around hour 6, so by midnight, insulin is dropping back toward baseline, though if you ate refined carbs late, it's still elevated. mTOR is starting to ease off, but it's not fully off. The maintenance truck is parking on the side of the house, but not coming in yet. The crew is checking their tools. Glycogen reserves in your liver are still substantial. The body has no urgency to dip into fat storage yet. You're sleeping by now if you're keeping reasonable hours, which itself helps because sleep hormones suppress evening insulin spikes that would otherwise stretch into hour 7 and 8. Around hour 12, so 6 a.m. the next morning, your liver glycogen is largely depleted. The freezer is empty. Your body shifts toward fatty acid oxidation, pulling triglycerides out of fat tissue and burning them. AMPK, that cellular energy sensor, starts flipping on. It's the molecular equivalent of the homeowner walking into the kitchen and saying, "We're running low. Time to be careful with what's left." mTOR starts flipping off in earnest. The maintenance crew is unloading their tools onto the porch. The pressure on the pipes is finally low enough that they can start working without their first weld blowing apart. By hour 14 to 16, between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. the next morning in our 6 p.m. to 10 a.m. window, autophagy is meaningfully ramped. Damaged proteins are being tagged with a marker called ubiquitin, the cellular equivalent of a recycling sticker, and packaged into structures called autophagosomes. Mitochondria that have been leaking are being broken down through a specific pathway called mitophagy, mito for mitochondria, phagy for eating, and replaced with new ones built from the salvageable parts. Misfolded proteins that contribute to cellular stress, the kind of accumulated junk that drives diseases like atherosclerosis and even some neurodegenerative conditions, are getting cleared. The maintenance crew is finally inside the house. The pipes are getting replaced section by section. The leaking power plants are being rebuilt. And then around hour 16, Margaret's first cup of coffee at 10 a.m., ideally still black because we'll get to that, and the body starts the slow ramp back into the fed state. Insulin starts to rise. mTOR turns back on. The maintenance crew finishes their last weld and packs up before the pressure climbs again. They've had a full shift. Damage has been removed. New parts have been installed. The artery lining is a little smoother than it was 16 hours ago. The mitochondria are running a little cleaner. The cells are a little more responsive to insulin than they were yesterday morning because they're not drowning in misfolded protein junk anymore. That's one night. Multiply by 90. Now here's the cycle I want you to see clearly because this is the emotional anchor of the whole video and the part that I think changes how a person over 60 thinks about their own metabolic situation. Cardiometabolic disease is not a straight line. It is not a slow downward slope from healthy to sick. It is a loop that spins faster the longer it runs. Constant grazing keeps insulin elevated. Elevated insulin keeps mTOR on. mTOR on suppresses autophagy. Suppressed autophagy means damaged cellular components accumulate. Leaky mitochondria, oxidized lipids, misfolded proteins, inflamed endothelium. Accumulated cellular damage worsens insulin sensitivity because cells choked with damaged components don't respond to insulin's signal as cleanly. Worsened insulin sensitivity creates more cravings, more snacking, more grazing because cells aren't getting the glucose signal properly. The brain says, "We must be hungry, eat again." The loop spins. Each turn makes the next turn a little faster. Each turn deposits a little more sediment in the pipes. Each turn rusts a few more joints. After 20 years of this, what started as a minor metabolic inefficiency in your 40s is now a full-blown clinical syndrome in your 60s. And that's why people who feel like they're doing everything right, eating reasonable food, watching their portions, even exercising regularly, still end up with a creeping A1C, creeping triglycerides, creeping waistline, creeping blood pressure. They're not doing anything obviously wrong with what they eat. They've never given their cells the off time. The loop has been spinning, uninterrupted since they were 35. Each year, it spins a little faster than the year before. By the time the cardiologist starts mentioning statins, the loop has been at full speed for a decade. Break any one link in that loop, and the whole cycle slows. That's the most important thing in this entire video. You don't have to fix everything at once. You don't have to overhaul your entire diet. You don't have to find an extra hour for the gym. Break one link. The 16-hour window happens to break two links at once. Insulin drops back to true baseline overnight, and autophagy gets a real shift. Two for the price of one timing change. Once that happens consistently, not once a week, not on Sundays only, but most nights of most weeks, the loop reverses direction. Sensitivity improves. Cravings shift because the cells are getting the glucose signal cleanly again. The waistline starts responding because visceral fat, the kind of fat wrapped around your liver and pancreas, is the most insulin-responsive fat in the body, and it shrinks first when insulin comes down. The order of unwinding tends to mirror the order of accumulation. Whatever went wrong last tends to come right first. Now let's compare two paradigms that someone over 60 will hear from their doctor today, because this is where the field actually disagrees with itself in a way that matters for what you eat tonight. Paradigm A, the one that dominated for 30 years and still drives most frontline nutrition advice, says, eat 6 small meals a day, keep blood sugar smooth, count calories, watch the saturated fat, and lose weight by burning more than you eat. The whole frame is energy balance. Calories in, calories out. The body is a furnace, food is the fuel, weight is the leftover. Paradigm B, what the last decade of evidence actually points to, says chronic insulin signaling is the upstream driver. The eating window is the most powerful lever. The body is not a furnace, it's a hormone-driven storage and repair system. And what your cells need more than fewer calories is more uninterrupted off time. Same calories, different timing, different outcome. When you compare the trials head-to-head, Cienfuegos 2020 versus standard calorie restriction, Sutton 2018 versus calorie-matched controls, Wilkinson 2020 versus baseline, the Mattson and de Cabo synthesis versus the older calorie restriction literature, the time-restricted approach matches or beats calorie restriction on insulin sensitivity, on ApoB, on blood pressure, on triglycerides, and crucially, on how easy it is to actually maintain over months and years. A 16-hour window is something a 65-year-old can do for the rest of their life because it doesn't ask them to be hungry, doesn't ask them to count, doesn't ask them to give up the foods they love at family dinners. A 1,400-calorie restricted diet is something most 65-year-olds quit by month 4 because it asks them to be hungry and counting and constantly negotiating with themselves. The biology and the human behavior data are pointing in the same direction. The lever is timing, not arithmetic. I've shown you the research. I've explained the mechanism. Now, what do you actually do? Before I get into the specifics, the second disclaimer moment. Everything that follows is meant to complement, not replace, your medical care. Especially if you're on insulin, sulfonylureas like glipizide, or you're taking blood pressure medication, you can become hypotensive or hypoglycemic when your eating window contracts. That conversation has to happen with your doctor first, not later. First, if you've had a recent cardiac event, if you're underweight, if you have a history of disordered eating, this protocol is not your first move. With that said, here's the protocol. Priority 1, set your last bite at 6 p.m., not 6:30, not around dinner time. 6 p.m. on a wall clock, the same way you'd set a doctor's appointment. The specificity matters because it does the math for you. 6 p.m. plus 16 hours is exactly 10 a.m. the next morning, which is a tractable target most people can hit without restructuring their entire morning. You can move both numbers earlier or later as long as the gap is 16 hours. 5:30 to 9:30 works, 7 to 11 works, but pick a wall and stick to it for 90 days before judging whether it's working. Why this specifically works for someone over 60. It gives your insulin 3 to 4 hours to come down before sleep. And elevated evening insulin is one of the documented disruptors of slow wave sleep, which is itself the sleep stage where overnight insulin sensitivity gets restored. So the 6 p.m. stop indirectly improves the very thing you're trying to improve twice over. Once through autophagy, once through sleep architecture. Common pitfall: people start at 8 p.m. thinking this is easier and never cross into the autophagy window meaningfully. They eat at 8, sleep by 11, wake at 7, eat breakfast at 7:30. That's an 11 and a half hour window. They get almost none of the benefit and conclude time-restricted eating doesn't work for them. The whole point is the 16-hour mark. Below 14, you're still in the transition zone. Below 12, you're not even there. Free version: this is already free. There's nothing to buy. The intervention is a wall clock you already own. Priority 2, make your 6 p.m. dinner Mediterranean pattern, olive oil, leafy greens, fatty fish 2 to 3 times a week, salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovies. The small oily ones are cheaper and lower in mercury than the big ones. Berries, ideally darker varieties because the polyphenol density is higher. Nuts. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, white beans. Reasonable portions of whole grains if you tolerate them, less if your insulin sensitivity is genuinely poor. Plenty of vegetables of every color. The reason isn't fashion. It's that this dinner pattern produces the smallest insulin spike for the calories consumed, which means insulin returns to baseline faster, which means you cross into the cellular cleanup window faster overnight. A high glycemic dinner, pasta, bread, sugary dessert, a glass of late wine, a beer, keeps insulin elevated for longer and shortens your effective autophagy window, even if your clock window is the same 16 hours. So someone who eats pasta at 6 p.m. might have a clock window of 16 hours, but a true biological window of 12 or 13 by the time insulin actually comes down. 2 people, same wall clock, different cellular outcome. Free version: lentils, sardines, frozen spinach sautéed in olive oil. That's a full Mediterranean dinner that runs under $5 a serving at any major U.S. grocery chain. Frozen vegetables are nutritionally equivalent to fresh, often higher in micronutrients because they're frozen at peak ripeness rather than picked early to ship. Canned sardines in olive oil, the small flat tin, $2 at Trader Joe's, $4 at Whole Foods, give you about 25 grams of high-quality protein, the cardiovascular benefits of long-chain omega-3, and a calcium boost from the soft bones. Common pitfall: people swap olive oil for vegetable oil because it's cheaper, then wonder why their inflammation markers don't move. Stick with olive oil, ideally extra virgin. The polyphenols are part of why it works. Priority 3, stay strictly fasted in the morning until 10 a.m. Water, black coffee, plain tea, that's it. Nothing with calories, not even cream, not even one of those zero-calorie creamers that has 6 ingredients on the label, not the splash of oat milk, not the half teaspoon of sugar. Why this matters: even small calorie inputs, and especially anything with protein or carbohydrate, trigger an insulin response, which switches mTOR back on, which shuts the maintenance crew down. You spent the night setting up the conditions for cellular cleanup. Don't end it 90 minutes early because you wanted a splash of milk. The clock window says 16 hours. The biological window depends on whether you actually held the fast. If 10 a.m. feels brutal at first, that's normal. Days 3 through 5 tend to be the hardest because your body is still expecting the morning calories it's been getting since elementary school. 2 weeks in, your hunger hormones, ghrelin in particular, which runs on a learned schedule, recalibrate. Most people stop noticing the morning fast by week 3. By week 4, it feels normal. If you still feel awful at week 3, lightheaded, irritable, brain fog that doesn't lift, the window may not be right for your body, your medications might need adjustment, or your electrolytes might be running low. Talk to your doctor before pushing further. There's no medal for forcing a protocol that isn't working for your physiology. Quick note on coffee. Black coffee has been studied repeatedly, and the consensus is that it does not meaningfully break a fast in healthy adults. Trace calories, no measurable insulin response in most studies. Plain tea is the same. Sparkling water with a squeeze of lemon is fine. Anything with measurable calories is not. What to track? At your next appointment, ask your doctor to add 3 things to your standard panel. Fasting insulin. Most insurance covers it. Most cardiologists don't order it routinely, and it'll change how you and your doctor see your metabolic state. ApoB, which is a more accurate marker for cardiovascular risk than the LDL number you've been watching. And if you can, HSCRP, which measures the kind of low-grade inflammation that drives arterial damage. With those 3 numbers plus your A1C, you have a real dashboard. Timeline, week 1 and 2. Energy may dip in the morning for a few days, then stabilize. Sleep often improves first because evening insulin is lower. Month 1, fasting insulin starts to drop. Triglycerides drop. Some people see early scale movement, some don't, doesn't matter. The cellular work is happening regardless. Month 3, A1C shifts measurably. ApoB starts moving. Blood pressure often drops 5 to 10 points. Month 6 and beyond, for people who started with metabolic syndrome, the cluster starts unwinding in the order it was built, sometimes in reverse order from how it accumulated. 3 things to know before you start. First, if you're on a statin, don't stop it without your cardiologist. We're adding tools, not subtracting. Second, if you take warfarin or clopidogrel, your INR or platelet response can shift when your eating window changes. Your prescriber needs to know. Third, if you've had a cardiac event in the last 90 days, this content is for prevention and long-term support, not acute recovery. Talk to your cardiologist before you change anything. For those of you watching, because someone you love is in the hard part of this, your husband just had a stent, your mother's A1C keeps drifting up, your father is on his 4th medication and looks worse every visit, your sister was just told she has pre-diabetes and she's terrified. I want to talk to you for a minute. The caregiver role is heavier than anyone tells you. You're worried, you're tired, you're cooking 2 meals because his diet is different from yours. You're tracking medications you didn't sign up to track. You're trying to help someone who may or may not want to hear it, who may have spent 40 years deciding for themselves what they eat and resents being managed in their 70s. Here's what I'd say. The 16-hour window is one of the gentlest interventions we have for someone resistant to bigger changes. It doesn't require new groceries. It doesn't require giving anything up. It doesn't require him to read a book or watch a video or have a conversation about feelings. It just requires moving the timing of meals he or she is already eating. If you can shift dinner to 6 p.m. together, make it a small ritual the way couples used to have set dinner times back when families ate together as a default rather than as an effort, you've done something measurable for the person you love without picking a fight about food. Margaret's story, the one I told you earlier, has a part I didn't mention. Her husband, Robert, is 65, still working part-time as a pharmacist, has been on a statin for 8 years and a blood pressure medication for 3. When Margaret started her 6 p.m. dinner protocol, she didn't try to convince Robert to do it. She just started serving dinner at 6 p.m. Robert ate dinner at 6 p.m. with her. That was the entire negotiation. After 90 days, Margaret's A1C dropped from 6.4 to 5.6. Robert's didn't drop as dramatically because his wasn't as elevated to start, but his fasting insulin came down from 11 to 7, his triglycerides dropped 40 points, and at his next physical, his cardiologist asked what he was doing differently because his ApoB had moved meaningfully for the first time in 8 years on the same statin dose. Robert hadn't done anything except eat dinner with his wife at 6 instead of at 7:30 in front of the news. The intervention was the timing. The ritual was the relationship. Both moved the numbers. And if you're doing it alongside the person you're caring for, you're protecting yourself too. This part matters because if you're a caregiver in your 50s or 60s, your own metabolic numbers are almost always being neglected while you focus on the person who's already sick. The data on caregiver health is grim. Caregivers of cardiac patients have measurably worse cardiovascular outcomes themselves than age-matched controls, partly from chronic stress, partly from neglected sleep, partly because their own appointments keep getting canceled to take the spouse to the cardiologist. Don't wait until you're the one with the diagnosis. The 6 p.m. dinner is the rare intervention that protects both people in the room at the same time, and it costs nothing extra to share. One pot of lentils, one pan of fish, one ritual at one table, two people unwinding the same loop in parallel. We started with the question of what happens to your cells when you stop eating after 6 p.m. The answer: a maintenance crew that's been locked out for years, sometimes decades, finally gets in. They tear out the corroded pipes. They replace the leaking power plants. They clear out the sediment that accumulates from decades of constant insulin signaling and the chronic mTOR-on state that defined most of American eating culture from the 1990s through 2015. By the time your first cup of coffee arrives at 10 a.m. the next morning, your cells are running cleaner than they have in a long time. Probably cleaner than they've been since you were 35. Do that 90 nights in a row, and your A1C, your ApoB, your blood pressure, your fasting insulin, and your triglyceride to HDL ratio all start to shift in the same direction at the same time. The textbook didn't describe any of this as possible 20 years ago. The textbook described 16-hour fasts as starvation and recommended 6 meals a day to keep your metabolism up. The textbook is catching up with the data now, but the lag is real, and the gap is the difference between the cardiology you'll get this year and the cardiology you would have gotten if your appointment were 17 years from now. You don't have to wait for the textbook. The data is already published. The intervention is already free. The only thing standing between someone over 60 and a meaningful shift in their metabolic numbers is the wall clock and 90 nights of consistency. Navigating this feels overwhelming because for 30 years the answer was eat 6 small meals and take this pill. That answer is out of date. It was always incomplete. We just didn't have the cellular evidence to know it at the time. You have more control over your insulin and your arterial health than you've been told. Not total control. Nobody has that. And anyone selling you total control is selling you a story, not a protocol. But meaningful, measurable control. And it starts with one number on the wall clock tonight. Not a supplement, not a $400 lab panel, not a coach. A wall clock you already own. Set it, hold it for 90 days. Get the 3 tests at day 90. Have the conversation with your doctor with numbers in hand. That's the entire move. If this resonated, the video on insulin resistance and small, dense LDL particles goes deeper into the second half of this loop. What's happening in your bloodstream, in the lining of your arteries, while the maintenance crew is working overnight. It's the piece most people miss when they think about cholesterol, and it's why 2 people with the same LDL number can have radically different cardiovascular outcomes over the next decade. Comment below with the time you're going to set your dinner wall at. I read every comment, and they genuinely guide what I research next. If half the comments are from people on metformin, the next video will be on metformin and time-restricted eating. If half are caregivers, the next video will be on tactics for spouses who don't want to be managed. The comments steer the channel. Buyer beware on 6 meals a day. The research has moved.